Australia is currently experiencing one of the worst cost of living crises in its modern history, making daily life unaffordable for an increasing number of people. Everything from groceries and fuel to utilities and rent has surged in price, putting immense pressure on the average Australian household. In major cities like Sydney and Melbourne, rental prices have skyrocketed to the point where even dual-income families are struggling to keep up. Supermarket bills, which were already high due to Australia's import reliance and distribution challenges, have only become more brutal, with inflation pushing essential goods up by 10 to 15% in just a year. For many, a simple lifestyle involving a roof over their heads, healthy meals, and manageable bills has turned into a luxury. Even those with full-time jobs are being forced to cut back on meals, switch off heating in winter, or skip medications. Meanwhile, wages have failed to keep pace with these rising expenses, resulting in a significant decline in purchasing power. This cost of living strain is pushing many Australians to the brink, with some even relocating overseas just to survive financially. It's no longer a matter of luxury or comfort. Just surviving in Australia is becoming economically unviable for the average person. Australia is facing an unprecedented housing crisis that is locking an entire generation out of home ownership and even making rental accommodation unaffordable for a large segment of the population. Property prices in cities like Sydney, Brisbane, and Melbourne have surged far beyond the reach of average earners. The median house price in Sydney, for example, exceeds $1 million, and even small apartments can cost over $600,000 in urban centers. Meanwhile, rent prices are climbing sharply due to a housing supply shortage and population growth, with many tenants being priced out or forced into shared accommodations well into adulthood. Government initiatives like first home buyer grants and stamp duty exemptions have largely failed to address the underlying problem: high demand and severely limited supply. International investors and property hoarders further inflate the market, making housing less of a necessity and more of an asset class for the wealthy. Many young Australians now face the grim reality of being lifelong renters, and even that is becoming a struggle. The housing crisis isn't just about financial strain, it's deeply psychological, creating feelings of hopelessness, instability, and exclusion from the so-called Australian dream. With shelter becoming a privilege instead of a right, the prospect of building a future in Australia is becoming alarmingly unrealistic. Australia once prided itself on having one of the best healthcare systems in the world, but today that system is buckling under immense pressure, making timely and affordable healthcare increasingly difficult to access. Public hospitals are overwhelmed, with wait times for essential treatments and surgeries stretching into months, even years in some regions. Emergency departments are constantly over capacity, forcing ambulances to queue outside and leaving patients waiting hours in distress. General practitioners, GPs, are also becoming harder to see, with many clinics now charging high out-of-pocket fees, even for basic consultations, as bulk billing becomes less common. Rural and regional Australians are even worse off, often having to travel hundreds of kilometers for specialist care or wait extended periods for mental health support. The strain on healthcare workers, many of whom are burnt out or leaving the profession, only worsens the situation. Additionally, aged care and disability support services are underfunded and poorly regulated, leading to neglect and system-wide failures. As a result, more Australians are turning to expensive private insurance for faster access, but even that comes with rising premiums and limited coverage. The promise of universal, accessible healthcare is fading rapidly, and for many Australians, getting sick now comes with the fear of financial disaster and endless waiting, making the country an increasingly inhospitable place to live, especially for the vulnerable. Living in Australia now means constantly facing the threat of climate-related disasters that are growing in both frequency and severity. Once considered rare or seasonal, extreme weather events like bushfires, floods, droughts, and heat waves have become almost year-round realities. The 2019 to 2020 Black Summer bushfires were a wake-up call to the world, destroying thousands of homes, displacing communities, and killing or injuring an estimated 3 billion animals. But the aftermath has not brought lasting relief. Since then, floods have ravaged parts of Queensland and New South Wales, displacing residents multiple times in the span of a year. Heat waves now routinely push temperatures above 45 degrees Celsius, 113 degrees Fahrenheit, not only threatening health but also straining infrastructure, causing blackouts and damaging crops. Water scarcity remains an ever-present concern, particularly in inland areas that struggle with prolonged droughts. These environmental pressures aren't just natural phenomena, they're exacerbated by political inaction and insufficient investment in climate resilience. Urban areas suffer from poor planning, leaving homes vulnerable to fire zones or floodplains, while regional communities face isolation and neglect during crises. Insurance companies have responded by hiking premiums or pulling out altogether from high-risk zones, meaning many Australians can no longer afford to protect their homes. The environmental challenges in Australia are no longer distant threats. They are a present and escalating crisis, making the country one of the most challenging places to live for both humans and wildlife. Beyond the visible economic and environmental issues, Australia is quietly experiencing a mental health crisis that is pushing many to the edge. The soaring cost of living, housing stress, job insecurity, and exposure to repeated natural disasters have combined to create a climate of chronic anxiety, depression, and emotional exhaustion. Even where help is available, the costs are steep, and therapy sessions or psychiatric support are financially out of reach for many. The stigma surrounding mental health still persists in several communities, leaving many to suffer in silence. Compounding this is a growing sense of social disconnection. The traditional Australian values of community and mateship are under strain as more people become isolated due to financial pressures, long work hours, and transient living situations. With fewer community centers, rising urban loneliness, and reduced family cohesion, individuals are left feeling unsupported and invisible. Young Australians, in particular, are expressing despair about their futures, with record levels of suicidal ideation and self-harm. The country's economic and environmental turmoil is not just destroying bank accounts and homes, it's breaking people's spirits. For many, the emotional cost of living in Australia now feels as heavy as the financial one, and it's a crisis that is growing louder by the day. One of the most disheartening reasons why living in Australia has become increasingly unbearable is the deep political stagnation and loss of faith in leadership. Despite the mounting crises, from housing and healthcare to climate and economic inequality, successive governments have often failed to enact meaningful, long-term reforms. Instead, politics has devolved into a cycle of short-term promises, partisan squabbling, and reactive policymaking that prioritizes popularity over progress. Major decisions are frequently delayed or watered down due to lobbying by powerful industries such as real estate, fossil fuels, or big supermarkets, leaving ordinary Australians feeling powerless and ignored. The result is a growing gap between citizens and the political class, with many Australians expressing frustration, anger, and apathy toward those in power. Young people in particular feel disenfranchised and hopeless about their future in a system that seems designed to serve the wealthy and maintain the status quo. Corruption scandals, mismanagement during national emergencies, and the slow pace of climate action have further eroded public trust. Many now believe that even voting doesn't lead to real change. When people feel like their voices don't matter and their basic needs are not being prioritized, disillusionment sets in. This widespread political fatigue is not just a side issue. It's one of the core reasons why life in Australia feels unsustainable for many. Without strong visionary leadership, the country risks falling deeper into crisis, with its people left to fend for themselves in an increasingly broken system.